should wear the microphone for the streaming, of course. That was bad thinking on my part. Okay, all right, we'll turn this down, because I don't think we will need it actually for the room here, but we will need it for the recording, this microphone. And here we go. Welcome to our last input session this semester. After 4 weeks of syntax, 2 weeks of morphology, 3 weeks of semantics, describing language, structures of language, looking at different ways of doing that, different models, different approaches. We're going to change perspective quite a bit today, looking at psycholinguistics. Up until now, all the semester we have been looking at of language as it is manifest in the product, that is spoken language or written language, and trying to analyze it. In psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics, which will also be a topic of today's lecture, the perspective is, as you know, the one to ask, well, how is all this processed in our brains? Clearly, language is in there somewhere. Language is represented in our brains. And first psycholinguistics, and now more recently, of course, also neurolinguistics, are asking the questions, where is it in the brain? How does the brain process language when it comes in, when it goes out, and all those questions. So, this is our program for today that you see in front of you. In both the psycholinguistics and the neurolinguistics sections, we will look at methods that we actually have at getting evidence for answering these kinds of questions, and then we will look at some experiments as they are done in psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics, and we will look at particular, malfunctions of language production in both areas. And then finally, I would like to take a closer look at language production and language perception. Again, there we need models, because our look into the brain, into the language brain, by way of psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics is not really sophisticated enough yet to get a full psycho or neurolinguistics-based picture of language production and comprehension. In any case, here we go. We start off with psycholinguistics. So here we have got one of those fields of research where two disciplines link up, linguistics and psychology in this case, and the interest is to study those mental processes that underlie our faculty of speech, producing speech and understanding speech. So it is a question of language in the mind. And as all disciplines have their particular typical questions which they ask, so does psycholinguistics. So first and foremost, psycholinguistics asks, how is language produced? How is it perceived? How is it understood? And because using language is not just processing, but also to a large extent memory in our memorized in our minds, the question, how is it stored and how is it retrieved or accessed when we need to use it actively? So that is one big field of questions. Then clearly another interesting question is, well, how does it get in there? How is language acquired? what are the steps that human minds run through as they acquire their first or their second languages, or third or fourth, and so on. Then question C is like taking a shot, a picture of the mind. So how is of the brain? But no, when we are, now I'm in psycholinguistics, so I'm talking of mind. Yeah, how is language represented in the mind? How does it link up maybe with other areas of our knowledge of the world, other areas of cognition that are there represented in our mind? A big question in psycholinguistics is the relationship between rules on the one hand and lexical and storage on the other. There are different models that give more weight to one over the other. And very interesting also, how is meaning represented? And the final group of questions, what happens when things go wrong? How does that surface? Or actually our avenue into this is really the other way around. We realize that something has gone wrong, and then we want to find out what's behind that. How has that come about? So in what follows today, I will concentrate on questions A and D. Language acquisition we will not deal with. We would need a couple more sessions for that. Now, big question is, how do we actually find out what's in the mind? I mean, this is a general question, of course, in psychology, because we cannot directly observe what's going on in our minds, right? So, psychology in that sense has to work like, God, now I have a lexical access problem. What's the name? Sherlock Holmes. Like Sherlock Holmes trying to trace down Dr. Moriarty, who leaves only sort of scattered traces here and there, scattered pieces of evidence, observable evidence. And from those clues, like Sherlock Holmes, psycholinguists try to piece together what's behind it, of the Dr. Moriarty behind it. So that would be Dr. Moriarty. The analogon would be the representation of language in our minds. So again, repeating what I just said. So the only choice we have is we can just collect clues that are observable, that are accessible to our senses. In the case of psycholinguistics, this is linguistic behavior. In other branches of psychology, those are other forms of behavior. So psychology, and by that dint also psycholinguistics, is an empirical science. So you go by the observable. And from what you have observed, you infer the properties of what is unobservable and of this complex underlying system. Now, there are two big groups of research methods in psycholinguistics. One is you observe the behavior of humans using language. You observe them in natural settings as they go about their daily business. You listen, you record the language behavior of competent speakers and writers and readers, or you also record the language behavior of learners, so that will be language development. This has been, and still is being worked on more by linguists than by psycholinguists, right? Of course, with crossovers. The other point about observations is observing malfunctions of language. If something goes wrong, somebody makes mistakes, errors, doesn't function maybe anymore in the way they used to, and from those malfunctions we can then try to draw conclusions on how things work in an unimpaired situation, because we have now seen what happens if some disturbance has occurred, like a brain lesion or something. The other big group of research methods are experiments. Everybody is familiar with the notion of the experiment in empirical sciences, where you set up an environment where you can simplify the situation in such a way that you can really focus on a specific problem, on a specific question. And typical psycholinguistic experiments would be lexical decision tasks or association tests, and we will try out a little bit of that later on. So I said we would, this is what the linguists do, and actually we have already sort of done some of this in describing what language looks like. So today we will just, in terms of observations, we will just look at malfunctions and then at experiments in psycholinguistics. So one type of malfunction that we are all familiar with is the tip of the tongue phenomenon, right? You're talking and then you can't think of a word, and you absolutely know that you know that word, but you cannot access it. No? So the memory trace that you know you have cannot be, this word cannot be retrieved from memory. Yeah? And then what we do is we go, very quickly our mind goes through options. Yeah. Sometimes we come up something like, I know it starts with k, or something like blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So what comes up as these alternatives that we know is not the right thing, usually words that are very similar in their sound shape, sometimes also meaning, but the sound shape is the more decisive thing in that. So this is a universal phenomenon that occurs with speakers of all languages, all ages, and so on and so forth. And then so one example would be, for instance, the speaker is looking for the word sextant, which was an instrument for navigation before radar was invented, navigation on the seas. They're sextant. Don't ask me how it worked, but if you're interested in historical seafaring, you have come across that word. Anyway, and this person couldn't access sextant and said second, sextet, sexton. Yeah. So you see that in all the alternative options, the number of syllables was the same as in the target word. Yeah? 2 syllables. In the first option, the beginning of the first syllable and the final syllable are actually identical. Only here we've got this consonant different, and so on and so forth. So you've got slight variations in the sound structure there. Everybody's familiar with this kind of phenomenon, I think. And we can also induce it. The tip of the tongue phenomenon can be induced. And thereby we can try to bring about some evidence which otherwise we'd have to listen around for hours and hours and hours waiting for people to have a tip of the tongue phenomenon. So we can set people a task like name the word for flat-bottomed boat used in Asia. It's a bit like a crossword puzzle task. And then this would also be an example from a search that one particular person ran through. They said Sampoon, Sarong, Cheyenne, Champagne, and the actual target word is sampan. I have not looked up which language it is from. Might be Thai, but I'm not sure. Yeah? And you see, I mean, the reason why I think it might be Thai is that sarong is also a Thai word, yeah? Which is semantically totally unrelated to sampan. But you've always got the fricatives there, yeah, the sersha as initial sounds, and you've always got nasals there in the second syllable. So there's this kind of this rough schema of the word is accessible, but not the word itself. So what we think we can conclude from this is, for instance, that words, the phonological storage of words, is not only in sort of as individual words with their individual syllable structure, sound structure, and so on, but also in larger groups of words that have the same global structures, like disyllabic words starting with s, yeah, and ending with n, that kind of general schematic structure. And so, as I said, the number of syllables is always identical in those word searches. Initial sounds are also present in the alternatives that are retrieved. Stress patterns are usually kept. And these are all phonological features, and what this tells us is that semantic and phonological information are not stored in the same place, because the tip of the tongue phenomenon always goes in very predominantly into the phonological storage direction, and that what I've already said, the phonological representation is not unitary. It's not just one package that you cannot unpack, but the sounds are stored, the syllable structure, the stress pattern, and even more abstract templates of syllable, of sound patterns. So that would be the tip of the tongue phenomenon. That is a malfunction which is accessible to all of us. Another one, of course, is slips of the tongue, which are just errors that occur involuntarily in spontaneous speech. They usually occur when we have when our mind has already made a sort of a general syntactic plan, and that we will revisit this theme then in the last section of today when we talk about speech production. So there is a plan for an overall syntactic structure, and therefore, of course, a plan for the meaning that came even before that. But then things can go wrong. The assembly of words, so the combination of sounds, may get mixed up. Or the assembly of words, and there may be the sort of wrong lexical items may be selected in the process of slotting actual lexical items into the syntactic structure which has already been planned. So the going into assemblage errors. These usually affect the beginnings of words, yeah? And if you know young children, you will have noticed young children, meaning really like 1.5, 2, 3 years old, they will do such things, not all of them to the same extent, quite regularly. Yeah? My daughter, when she was little, she said things like Laschwappen, yeah? Or I want for Waschlappen, or Salanje, she loved Salanje. Yeah? So you've got an exchange of initial sounds and syllables. This changing around of initial sounds can also sort of extend over parts of a phrase, and that's where this notion of the spoonerism comes in. somebody wanted to say, you've wasted the whole term, but came out, you've tasted the whole worm. Yeah? Or the person whose name has given a name to this phenomenon, Reverend William Spooner, was an Oxford Don in the late 1800s, and he apparently did these things quite regularly. I have no idea whether he was just playing around or whether this was just a slip which happened to him quite often. And then in speeches, or talking to colleagues, he would say such things. Supposedly wanting to say the dear old Queen, he would say the queer old Dean. So those are Spoonerisms, and in the popular culture of the British Isles, they are something that people are aware of because, as you may have noticed, the Brits have a strong sense for word play and playing with language. I don't know, maybe I am not so familiar with American, US popular culture. Would you say it's also things like Spoonerisms and so on are something that people like to create also? Mm-hmm. Yeah, those would be intentionally created blends, right? What I'm talking about here is unintentionally arising blends. Yeah? So somebody wants to say whatever was pretty terrible. So you have a choice of saying it was grisly or it was ghastly, and then not having made that decision, you actually pronounce the word ghastly. Yeah? Which doesn't exist. Same may happen with you want to say shout, but you could also express it by yell and come out by shell, which does exist but means something else, of course. Or expect and suppose. These are all examples from the literature that report observations of what has happened to people when they were speaking. So slips of the tongue. And we all do these once in a while. Yeah? Selection errors, meaning we just select a wrong item to slot into a pre-planned structure. This can happen on the phoneme level, phonological fool. So there's not an exchange. It's not a Spoonerism, but just one single phoneme was selected wrongly, and that can create humorous effects if what comes out is a word that exists in the language and somehow it makes meaning, yeah? It makes sense. Or a reading list, a leading list. Okay, or selecting the wrong word. One which is relatively widespread because there's quite a number of people who are not entirely secure with left-right, assigning left and right. So somebody wanting to say turn right but saying turn left. And this is also a source of humor sometimes. Somebody wanted to say we need a few laughs to break up the monotony, and came out with saying we need a few laughs to break up the monogamy. Yeah? Or living organisms instead of living organisms. You could say this is a Freudian slip, but maybe that's an overinterpretation. Now this term of malapropism you may come across in literary studies because the phenomenon occurs mostly with so-called of words of a higher stylistic level that were imported into English from Latin, from French and Greek, yeah? Where people maybe are not entirely sure always of the meanings of those words. And in a period of the history of English in the 17th century, after there had been a huge influx of such learned words into the language, it became fashionable to use them in polite society. And in a play from the 17th century, there is a character who is called Mrs. Malaprop, and she does those things all the time. But of course, there also, I'm really terrible at telling jokes, but I'll tell you this one because it fits here. Everybody knows what a Heizkörper is in English, a radiator. Okay. Well, so somebody walks into a flower shop and says, well, looks around and says, well, can I have 5 gladiators, please? And the shop assistant says, I'm sure you mean the gladioli. Ah, yes, of course, the gladiators. Well, you need to do that in the Actually, you need to do that bilingually. Gladiators are the Heizkörpers. Okay. Slips of the tongue, very briefly, slips of the ear. The first one is an anecdote which is told in your textbook by George Yule about a person who went to Sunday school and for months thought they were singing about a little bear who was cross-eyed and who was called Gladly. Yeah? Because to Sunday school you go as a child and you tend to think of bears rather than crosses. Yeah? But really what was being sung was a hymn that was called Gladly the Cross-Eyed Bear, or Great Ape, Great Ape. And of course this has this kind of slip of the ear has become almost like a genre in web communities. You know, the Agathe Bauer songs, do you know them? Yeah? This especially listening to English pop lyrics and not misunderstanding, misanalyzing the actual lyrics. So people who have listened to Michael Jackson's I Got the Power thought it was about Agathe Bauer. Yeah? Or what else? I mean, there's quite a few. Yes, a real story of a friend of mine. When she was a kid, she thought and she wondered, heard these songs about the ants are my friends, they're blowing in the wind. She was only a little girl, so she wasn't thinking about answers, but rather about ants. Yeah? The ants are my friend is blowing in the wind. Or Dirty Diana has been heard as Da geht der Gärtner. If you go onto the net, you find dozens and dozens of examples of that. It's also almost developed into an art form. Okay, so those will be observations. Experiments. The advantages of experiments over observations are something that is not on here is that they save you a lot of time. You don't have to hang around waiting for things to happen. You make them happen, and you can make them happen in specific ways, which is another way of saying that you have more control over variables. Who is involved in the study? You can select your participants. You can keep certain conditions constant, how awake or tired they are, what their age is, how many languages they know apart from the language that you are studying, and so on and so forth. So that enables us to focus and plan the research more exactly. But everything, nothing has only advantages. Disadvantages of experiments are that even though you can control variables, there may be variables that you are not aware of, hidden, unknown variables that you can then not really draw into your reckoning of what's happening in this experiment. Another important point about experiments is that, of course, they're artificial. That's the character of an experiment. You bring people into a certain place, give them a certain time, etc., etc., and usually a very closely defined task to do. This is not something that we all do on an everyday basis. So when we then look at the strategies that our participants use to do this task, how sure can we be that outside the experimental situation they would do the same? Yeah? But really, we have no choice if we want to do an experiment, and for many questions it really is necessary to do so. And our only choice then, we just have to live with these imponderabilities. Just for those of you who are not sure what a variable is, that is a quality or a value in your experimental design. For instance, characteristics of your subjects. Are they male, are they female, are they 20, are they 50, are they monolingual, are they bilingual, etc. So that would be variables. Okay, now one very sort of time-honored but still used type of experiment are word association tests to find out how the connections, what connections there might be in our mind between different words. Yeah? So what you do is you give a stimulus to your participants, a stimulus word, and they have to say or write down the first word that comes to their mind. I'm now going to give you 3 words. Please write down the first word that comes to your mind. The first word is day. The second word is blue. And the third word is red. And what has happened in psycholinguistics is that for a number of languages, standard word associations have been done, created or collected. You ask several hundred people, but actually the normalization is over 100 people, and and then you see how many of them have word X, Y, or Z as their first association. Now, but let's collect your associations for day. We can even do a complete collection because there's only a few of us. Light or night? Light. Anyone else? Okay. Day and sunlight. Okay. Which is what we are missing in here. Other associations? Night. Night. Any other night? 2 nights. What did you? Light. Okay. Light. What did you have? What's your first association? What was your first association? Bright. Okay. For British English, the Edinburgh Word Association list, this is what was the result. Over 100 participants. So 50% had night as their first association, 13% light. Then daytime, dream, nigh, interesting. So like the day is nigh, whatever. The day is near. Okay. What we see here is that we have opposites, yeah, day and night, but we also have compounds: daylight, daytime, daydream, daybreak, day life. A day in the life of. Yeah, again, collocation. Long day, collocation. The day is night. That is also a collocation from a phrase, from a set phrase. What about blue? Yellow. Any more yellows? What else? Red. Okay. Any more reds? Okay. Apron. C. Okay, so we've got a number of collocates, and we've got other members of the set of colors, and they are kind of complement. What's the actual complementary color of blue? Is yellow, right? Complementary color? No, orange is not a primary color. I think it's red, green, blue, yellow. I think. No, green is also a mix. The primary colors are yellow, blue, and red, I think. Okay. Physics 3. Okay. So the standard associations from 100 native speakers of English from the 1980s was, and here you see more of a spread than with day. You can see that. There's not such a high percentage for the most frequent one, 20% said sky. Then quite a lot of people have colors, and then we've got more collocations, but also connotation. Yeah? Blue blood, aristocracy, and so on. Bluebells, bluebirds, and so on. What becomes already accessible through this small set here also is that, of course, word associations are not are connected with our daily experience, with culture in the widest sense. So if you live somewhere where there are lots of bluebells in spring, then you're likely to have that as an association. If something like a bluebell doesn't exist in your environment, you won't. And so for red, I'm not going to ask you for these now. We have again, sort of the first, not again, actually we have here as the most frequent associations, we've got colors, and then we've got flag, and you might ask yourself, why flag? Yeah? These are based on association tests done in the late 70s, early 80s, where the Cold War, communism, red, the color of communism, the big enemy, and the red flag of communism and so on was still quite prominent in people's minds and in public discourse. This is my explanation why red flag occurs here at all. Yeah? Because flags per se are not necessarily red. Okay, and the flag is actually more frequent than rose, for instance. But now I'm getting curious what you did have for red. Yeah? Black. Black. Heart. Hot or heart? More. blood. Blood. Okay. Any more interesting? Hot. Like red hot. Okay. Thank you. So those would be association tests, and what they can tell us is they actually mirror the semantic relations, yeah, that we found when we were studying the semantics of in lexical relations. Hyponyms and superordinates, hyponyms, co-hyponyms, yeah, antonyms, collocations, and connotations. All those we found in the word associations. Well, we didn't have connotations in the few examples that we had here, but I think we had all the others. So there seems to be psychological reality to those semantic relations that the semanticists have come up with. Another type of experiment would be a lexical decision experiment. That's about what it looks like. So subjects are presented with a word on a computer screen, and then they have to decide whether, for instance, this is a real English word, and what is measured is their reaction time and also accuracy. Yeah. So what this tells us about is how much activation is there. If there is activation in this part of the lexicon, then the decision will be made more quickly. Or similar task, a word is presented to the participants and they have to pronounce the word. They don't have to decide yes, no, but they have to pronounce it. So this is just a makeshift imitation of what such a lexical decision experiment is like. Could you please, if you think this is an English word, clap, and if you think this is not an English word, do just one quick knock on the table, okay? Now I'm just going to give you 3 stimuli, and here we go. Next one. What was interesting was this one, where this is just very rough, but here the latencies of it seemed to take you longer to decide, because Glav was positive, so this looks very similar. You were quicker on deciding on this one because it has got an impossible, it infringes phonotactic rules. Yeah? V is not a legitimate consonant cluster in English. So the way, when you design such an experiment, then you manipulate the ways in which you design those non-words. How similar are they to actual words, or do they contain illegitimate sound arrangements? Do they infringe phonotactic rules? And so on and so forth. And by the accumulated measures of many stimuli plus many participants, then you try to come to inferences about how the words are actually stored and how the rules about, in this case, the phonological makeup of words of English are operated in when people perceive language. Either you can do this visually, like we have imitated here, but of course you could also do that orally. What is done very frequently is to use so-called semantic priming in such experiments. You present, so the whole stimulus consists of 2 words, and sometimes the first word has a semantic connection to the second word, and in other cases they're totally disconnected. And the effect that you find is that in the case where there is a connection, the reaction time is shorter. So there's an activation there already in an area of the brain. And a combination like, but if you prime bread with butter, people's decision on bread will be quicker than if you have like a sequence like nurse and bread. Yeah? So that would be semantic priming. Another experiment is so-called dichotic listening. This is built on the knowledge that language in most people is processed in the left hemisphere of the brain, which is more directly connected to the right ear than to the left ear. Yeah? And so you play 2 different stimuli into each ear of your participants, for instance, cat in the left, dog in the right, and the word which is played to the right ear is more often correctly identified or remembered than the word which is played into the left ear. So that's come to be known as the right ear advantage. And the crucial thing is that this right ear advantage works for linguistic input, but not for other sound input. So on the basis of this, we conclude that the processing of linguistic input in particular is concentrated in the left hemisphere. And talking about hemispheres of the brain now brings us to neurolinguistics, which is now the study of language, and not just the mind in abstracto, but the physical substrate, namely the brain. Yeah? The relationship between the language and the brain. Where in the brain can we see activity when people deal with language, when they perceive it, when they produce it, and so on. There are different anatomical pieces of anatomical information that are interesting here. We're not going to look at a complex anatomical drawing now with different areas of the brain, but one author, Paul Scoville, had suggested a very nice demonstration, let's say, of where language is in the brain. And that is, if you cap your ear with the palm of your hand, then, I will show it to you in a moment, then your first 2 fingers will sort of extend almost to the top of your skull, right? Like this, these 2 fingers. And underneath these 2 fingers, there is a strip of brain surface, which is the motor cortex, where our voluntary control of body movement is located. And to the bottom of our 2 fingers here, yeah, the bottom of the middle finger, about here, above the ear, there is an area in the brain that controls the voluntary movement of head, mouth, and throat. So this is the place where that's active when we speak. Yeah? And at the bottom of the index finger is an area that processes incoming sound stimuli. So these would be the 2 areas, and 2 areas that were first identified in the late 19th century. The motor area, the motor cortex part, by Paul Brocard, who was a French doctor, And so that would be this one, Broca's area, the part of the motor cortex where our face, jaw, tongue muscles control the larynx is carried out, and here above the back of our ear, Wernicke's area. Karl Wernicke was also a doctor. I think he may have even worked in Vienna, I'm not sure now. And both of them found out about that because they had patients who had suffered from strokes and had brain lesions in those areas, and those aspects of language were not working for those patients anymore. Yeah. So this gray thing, the thing that's colored in gray, is the motor cortex as such. Yeah? And there is a bundle of nerves that connects Broca's and Wernicke's area. And for instance, if that is impaired, also by brain injury or through a stroke, then the connection between listening and producing doesn't work anymore. So what we cannot do then is imitate. If somebody tells us to imitate something, we can perceive it, but we cannot produce an imitation of that word or sequence. You have this drawing in your textbook. I think it has moved to page 164 in the latest issue, but I'm sure you will be able to find it. This is huge, grossly oversimplified, we know now. Yeah? So language is not just in these 3 bits there. Yeah? Generally, you may know that in any case, this first sort of generation of brain research, really trying to locate all our functions, not just language, but all sorts of functions that cognitive functions that we have in actually specific, closely circumscribed parts of the brain, has turned out to be only parts of the truth. And in actual fact, as with language, as with most other things, functions of our body and of our mind are distributed over the entire brain. And this is really still a largely undiscovered continent, I would say, even today. Even today, though today we have more sophisticated ways of finding out about the workings of the brain and language than just looking at injury and malfunction, because we have got instrumental ways of measuring brain activity, which were not developed for neurolinguistic research, but generally for neurological research, medical research. You may be familiar with fMRI. Yeah? Lots of people, not your age, but older ones, have MR examinations, magnetic resonance examinations. So an earlier one was the so-called PET scan, and that is also still used for experiments in science more than in medicine. What you do there is you inject the participant a small amount of radioactive substance, which kind of glues onto the glucose in the person's blood, and then the machinery measures the radiation, and wherever there's particular large amount of blood and glucose being consumed by the brain, then there will be more radiation, and this will light up in different colors on the computer screen. Yeah? So what this picture shows is blood flow in the brain, and then you set up an experiment where you give your participants specific tasks, and you observe what happens to the blood flow in the brain while the people are solving those tasks. And such clear pictures are always the result of calculations of many measurements of many people. These are averages of over a larger number of measurements. But that's an invasive method. Yeah? You're doing something to somebody's body, injecting them radioactive material. There is a more recent development. It's also not brand new anymore, but it's getting developed in more sophisticated ways all the time. The functional magnetic resonance imaging technology, fMRI, in German MR, right? The everyday abbreviation of that. And the great thing about that is it's not only less harmful, but it's also more powerful than the PET scan technology. That works on the basis of magnetism and the response of cells in our blood to a strong magnetic field. And so what is measured is intensity of blood flow. That's what's represented also on this image here, right? So the coloring stands for different energy levels in the brain as a person is doing a certain cognitive task. A very interesting recent study has tried to see if the team tried to see if they can create a map of semantic representation of words in our brains. This was published only last spring. I hope the video works here as well, and then we can actually watch it. Yes, it does.
This is a map of someone's brain, showing roughly which areas respond when they hear different words. For example, there's a small area in the middle frontal gyrus that reliably responds to hearing the word top. But it's not just one word, one location. A single word can activate a whole range of different brain regions. So we find the word top in a bit of brain that seems to respond to words associated with clothing and appearances. But also here with numbers and measurements. And here with buildings and places. We usually think of language as being restricted to certain sections, like the temporal lobe. So researchers were surprised to find activity all across the brain and in both hemispheres. The map was made by scientists at the University of California, Berkeley. They put volunteers in an MRI scan and had them listen to stories for 2 hours.
Back in the front again, deep, and she pulls out a packet match that had been laundered at least once.
By monitoring blood flow to different parts of the brain, they worked out which places were responding to the meaning of the words. The semantics. They found that different bits of the brain responded to different kinds of words and concepts. And they could group them into rough categories, shown here by the different colours. Dark green bits, for example, were most activated by words to do with numbers, red bits by social words. Here in the right temporoparietal junction, this speck of brain, just a few millimetres across, was found to respond to words like wife, mother, pregnant, and family. And this bit just next door responds to some of the same social words like family and wife, but also words to do with places and people like house and owner. Generally, the concepts represented in each brain region relate to other functions that scientists already know about. So words to do with how things look, such as stripes, are likely to be found near the visual cortex. And although each individual's map is different, looking at these 3 brains, it's clear that different people have a same kinds of concepts in the same kinds of places. This is the first time we've been able to map the semantic systems of the brain in such detail, discovering that words are grouped by meaning, and revealing just how complicated and widespread the word maps in our heads really are. And a brain map is available online for anyone to explore.
Okay, thank you. Pretty fascinating stuff, that, I thought. Okay. So as I said, and it's a largely undiscovered continent, and I think the visual representation they chose really then started to look like a map when they sort of folded out the brain onto a two-dimensional space. So this continent analogy is actually sort of quite evident there. Yeah?
This map only accounts for semantic meaning of words in the brain, but not really for like syntactic logic of language.
No, this was a study about semantics. Yeah. There are also studies about syntax, of course, which I have no information about really recent stuff, so I better not say anything. But syntax of studies that I know about, that maybe 10 years old, there still seemed to be quite a lot of concentration on the left hemisphere there. But maybe that's already been relativized in the meantime. Okay, then one further technique that I have experienced myself once is this one, which is actually sort of a relatively traditional one that's been around for a while, using again a medical technology, electroencephalography, EEG, where again electrical activity in the brain is picked up through electrodes that are placed on your scalp. It takes about 1.5 hours to be set up for this experiment. You get this cap on, and then all the electrodes are fixed to your head. And then again, you do language-related tasks, and the electrical activity is picked up and computed over a long series of tasks for the individual, and then also computed over a large number of individuals, so that you get reliable measurements. And one pretty robust outcome from many such studies has been that our brains deal with unforeseen stimuli, or unpredictable stimuli, stimuli that don't make sense, with a certain latency in terms of it slows them down about 250 milliseconds. So if you present participants with, I like my coffee with cream and sugar, and then you ask them to press a button, they do that within 50 to 70 milliseconds. If you give them a sentence, I like my coffee with cream and dog, it takes them 300 milliseconds to press the button. And this kind of latency, the P300, the 300 millisecond latency, as I said, is a very robust outcome over many, many, many studies. So this is the first response of the visual cortex only takes about 50 milliseconds, which is simply the time it takes for a stimulus that has entered our eye to reach the visual cortex. But if something is not congruent with our expectations, then our assumption is that some other cognitive functions have to be switched on, and that takes some time, namely those extra about 250 milliseconds, which makes for the 300 millisecond response. So this is just for illustration. Another example, again, I tested Diane's knowledge of the issue versus I tested Diane's broccoli of the issue. A word about language disorders, because that's also something that unfortunately we may really come across in our everyday lives, called aphasia, speech impairment, language disorders that are due to damage to specific parts of the brain, for instance through stroke. Yeah? The name aphasia comes from Greek, from the word speechless, and what aphasia allows us to do again is make a connection between a language function and where in the brain it seems to be located and mainly processed. There are, of course, this is not a medical lecture, so we will just take really snapshots of two main types of aphasia, linked up to the two areas in the cortex that we mentioned earlier, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So if the motor cortex, the control of the movements of the articulatory organs, is impaired, then we have patients who clearly have an intention to communicate. They have got a plan. They want to say something, but they are struggling heavily. Usually they are aware of that they are struggling and they get extremely frustrated. They utter mostly nouns. Yeah? There are hardly any to no function words there. But this is a person trying to talk about a medical appointment. Yeah? So as you can see, the only function word here is and, yeah, the conjunction and. So that would be the difficulty to form the word, the utterances. Difficulty finding appropriate words, lack of function words, as I have said. Another characteristic of Broca's aphasics is that they lack function words, so the syntax seems to be impaired too, and so they have to use their everyday knowledge to interpret sentences. They cannot use grammatical information. So what happens is they will see the sentence, the mouse was chased by the cat. And when they see sentence number 3, the cat was chased by the mouse, for Broca's aphasic, this has the same meaning as the first sentence, because our world knowledge tells us that 3 is very unlikely outside cartoons. Yeah? So the grammatical information through the passive construction is not available to this person. They interpret the sentence on the basis of their knowledge of the world. And so sentence 2, interestingly, if you test a greater number of Broca's aphasics, it's the split. Some will go for one interpretation, will go the same way as for sentence 3, yeah? But some will go by their world knowledge, yeah? And interpret this as that actually it was the dog that was chasing the cat and not vice versa. Okay, now the opposite case, if you like, if the sensory part of the language cortex, Wernicke's area, is affected, Then you have people who are very fluent, overly fluent, but what they say doesn't make sense. One reason we think this is the case is that they don't understand what is being said to them, so they cannot react to something in a meaningful way. So this would be an example. How are you today, Mrs. A? Yes. Have I ever tested you before? No, I haven't. No, I don't. All right, I'm now aware. So if I can help this, like this, to make it, we're seeing him for this. That is my father. So these are sort of bits, grammatical bits, phrases uttered fluently, but making no sense. So the difficulties lie in speech comprehension. The patients are usually unaware of their deficit. And as an interlocutor, you cannot make out their communicative intention. But interestingly, the word order and is correct. The rules of syntax seem to apply. And one other type of aphasia I've already mentioned, when this bundle of nerves between those two areas is impaired, then patients cannot repeat what has been said to them. Okay, so much for aphasia. And now our last little chapter on speech production and comprehension. Now, on a very general level, speech production and comprehension are, of course, mirror images of each other. So, if we start out from production, we as speakers have some kind of intention. We have a meaning in our mind that we want to express. So there is a meaning. We send it into language production, where it is associated with a form, syntactic, morphological, phonological form. And then we utter this, and somebody else receives the stimuli. They are decoded, they are comprehended, and meaning is extracted from that form. So on this level of generality, they are mirror images of each other. However, when we look more closely, we will see that the two processes cannot really proceed in an exact mirror image of each other, and they don't. Models of speech production, there are around quite a number of them around. One which is still very influential, even though by now it's 25, 26 years old, 27 years old, is the one by Willem Leveld, which is a linear model. And that is a characteristic which distinguishes it from more recent models, which tend to be non-linear. Anyway, but with the linear model, we can get the stages, the different elements worked out more clearly. So first step is conceptualization. We think of something that we want to say or write. Some meaning arises in our mind. Second stage, formulation, putting it into a linguistic form. Articulation, either by sounds or writing, putting graphic shapes on paper or choosing something on a keyboard. And as we're doing this, self-monitoring. The first stage, the meaning, then in the formulation stage, stage 2, we plan the message. So we pan out the great plan, syntactic, morphological, word formation rules. That is where the selection errors occur. Yeah? If you think back to the beginning of today's session, we were talking about assembly errors and selection errors at the formulation stages, where we sometimes make the wrong selection of a word, of a sound, or of how we fill the syntactic slots. Then in stage 3, which is the articulation stage, where the movements of our articulatory organs are coordinated, that's where these assembly errors occur in the pronunciation, like the spoonerisms that we said, pig and fat, big and fat. The scan is a sandal sheet. The sun is a scandal sheet. And in the 4th stage, as we hear what we are saying, yeah, as we hear the product of the articulation phase, we get this feedback through our own ears, and we can self-correct our own speech slips of the tongue or speech errors. He was so drunk that he blah 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 blah. Yeah. So this would be Leveld's model of speech production. As I said, it's a linear model, assuming that we run through each stage in succession, complete the first, then enter the second, complete the second, blah blah blah. More recent models actually depart from the assumption and have collected evidence for is that all these things actually occur in parallel, and the different parts of speech production also influence each other. Now, when we go to speech comprehension, even if we stay with a linear model, we see that we cannot really make do with just one line of events. Because what we do when we comprehend speech is we sort of access it from 2 directions. We access it from top down. That is, we know about the context, we have a knowledge of the world, we judge which situation we are in, who our interlocutors are, what has come before, and thereby make predictions of what is going to happen. Yeah? We know, and we have a repertoire of syntactic structures that we know and so on. So if we hear the beginning of a sentence, our mind immediately computes, there's of like, given this beginning, there are like 7 different ways this might continue, and then narrowing down the options as the utterance proceeds, right? So that will be top-down processing, starting with the overall context and the larger units, and then narrowing down the choices. But of course, at the same time, as our mind is also working bottom-up, because what's coming in through our ears is a stream of sounds, nothing else. And our mind sets to analyze those sounds, the stream of sounds. Which sounds are they? In which sequence do they occur? Where is a boundary between words? Yeah? Or to stay on the sound level, where are stressed syllables? Where are the unstressed syllables? And then building on this, where are the boundaries between the words? Which kinds of words are those? How do these fit with the syntactic structure? And then at one point, the top-down and the bottom-up processes sort of cross paths. Yeah. So bottom-up, you go from sound, word to sentence. Top-down, you go from global meaning, syntactic meaning, words to sounds. And that is also probably why our speech comprehension can work so quickly, because two types of processes are working concurrently, and whoever comes to an interpretation first has won, so to say. It doesn't matter who won, as long as the mind, the person, gets to an interpretation of what's going on. As a piece of evidence that there is top-down processing, people have designed an experiment like this one. Yeah? So with some sound engineering, they produced the sequence eel, which is there in between the slashes for you, and inserted it into different sentences. Yeah? It was found that the bit was on the axle, it was found that something was on the shoe, etc., etc. That the eel was on the orange, it was found that it was on the table. In all four cases, the actual sound which was there was always eel, nothing else, with the first phoneme missing. But what happened was that the participants in the experiment actually heard complete words there, and they heard different words depending on the context. So in the context of the axle, they heard wheel. In the context of shoe, they heard heel. In the context with orange, they heard peel. And with the table, they heard meal, even though those initial consonants were not physically there. So our mind fills in stuff that is not there or that we cannot hear if we're thinking of noisy environments and so on and so forth. That is also why the more we know about a topic that is being talked about, the better we understand. People we know well, where we know what they're talking about, we also understand a lot better in noisy circumstances than people we don't know, or maybe that we're just overhearing, where we don't know any of the context and what they're likely to say. So there is this knowledge store that we have that fills in bits which are actually missing or unhearable for us in a concrete message which is coming in. So that would be top-down processing. And I will skip this next one and just also mention so-called garden path sentences, which is also a demonstration of how, again, top-down processing, how our mind predicts what's going to be the likely continuation in this stream of sounds which is coming in. So if a sentence like this is usually done with reading experiments. Since Jay always jogs a mile, seems like what? So as we read, we take this as a transitive construction. Jay jogs a mile, but then suddenly the continuation does not allow us to maintain this interpretation of the sentence. Yeah? We have to reconstruct our image of the syntax here. Since Jay always jogs, comma, a mile seems like a short distance to him. This kind of sentence has been given the name garden path sentences from the saying, so to lead somebody up a garden path, that is, lead him to a point, up a wrong way, yeah? From mazes in gardens, yeah? So you take a wrong turning in your syntactic interpretation, and then you come to a point, which here is the word seems, where you realize, oops, this is a dead end, yeah? I have to go back to the next branching and take another interpretative road of this sentence. Here are a couple more of such sentences, if you'd like to have a look at them. The likes of linguistic puzzles. So what happens in most of these sentences is that the first interpretation of, this is a transitive construction gets thwarted. Yeah? On the next slide you have got the solution, which I'm not going to talk about now. I would just like to mention how the semester continues. There is of course the final exam, but next week we will meet. Julia will be here as well, and we can discuss questions, have a sort of do a review, discuss questions. You're also aware that Julia has opened a forum where we would like you to post those questions. They will have absolute priority in the discussion, and it's also possible for people who are just listening, for everybody of course to enter questions into that forum. The exam per se has got 3 parts. No, before I say that I have to say something else. Next week, Monday, will be the 23rd. 2 days later, Vanya, the e-tutor, will do a face-to-face meeting on Wednesday morning, 10 till 12 in Unterrichtsraum, but please check it on the Moodle. She put it there, but I'm not 100% sure I remember the time correct. It's definitely Wednesday, where you can also ask questions and discuss things. Okay, so 3 parts to the exam. A multiple choice part, which you're already familiar with from introduction number 1, where you have to define terms, recognize definitions, etc., etc. Then the transcription, this time is active, not just recognizing, but active. So that again is split into 3 parts. Individual words, about 40 words of coherent text, which should be in broad transcription, but very importantly should also have the stress marks, sentence stress. And the third transcription part is 1 sentence, where we ask you for a narrow transcription. And the introduction to this will also tell you which aspects of narrow transcription. So you don't have to do all of the allophones in the transcription, just a selection. Yes, and then there is a part where you have to actively work with language material, like a set of words where we ask you to write down all the possible semantic relations that hold between these words. Yeah. Or do a morphological analysis of a phrase. Recognize what's lexical, what's functional, what's bound, what's free, what's prefix, what's suffix, etc. Yeah? And also in syntax, of course. Okay, and the scoring is such that you need a minimum of 40% on each part, and overall it's got to be 60%. Do you have questions at this point? Yeah? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Well, talk to in person. Well, you can come to my office hour. Yeah. or on the forum. Yeah, Vanya will look at the forum also. Okay. Okay. Then thank you for coming. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week.